The time is now to start a journey to find true freedom. Break the chains. Become God's best. This is Freedom Quest with Terry Baxter.
Ariella, I'm looking forward to today. I've heard about your story, and from the first time I heard it, it touched my heart. For several reasons. I was in the Iowa legislature as a state representative from 2014 to 2022. And when I was in the legislature working on some of these issues, this was happening in your life. This is what you were experiencing out there. So what we're going to do, I'm just going to invite you to tell your story. And what we're talking about during this session is a whole area of gender identity confusion and spiritual warfare. Could you just take a moment and just share your story as to what happened to you?
So to reiterate, my name is Ariella. I'm a senior in high school now. I started to be pushed into gender identity when I was about 10 years old by a middle school art teacher. I had friend groups of people who were not Christian, and I was a tomboy, so they pushed me into this idea that, oh, maybe you're actually a boy. And as we know in scripture, that's not true. God makes our identity when he puts us in our mother's womb, and it talks about it in Psalm 139, one of my favorite Psalms. So around middle school, I started going through this transition where I was socially going by a different name, and I had a therapist who wanted to get me on hormones and start that physical transition without my parents' consent. And they didn't know until they pulled me out of therapy with that woman. So I had a lot of adults in my life pushing me into this, and it wasn't until sophomore year of high school when I was in probably the worst mental state of my life. I sat in my room and I cried out to God for probably the first time since elementary school. And I said, if you're real, prove to me that you're real, or I'm going to kill myself tomorrow. And God came to me in a dream, and it was the most beautiful dream I had ever experienced in my life. In this dream, there were two fields. I stood on one side. They were split perfectly down the middle. The side that I stood on was bare. There was one dead tree. No fruit was being produced. And I believe it was referring to how my life was producing no fruits of the Spirit, hence the wonderful shirt today. And on God's side, there was this beautiful light, and it was like the Garden of Eden on his side. And I heard him in the most calming and fatherly voice I had ever heard. He told me how he put me in my mother's womb. He made no mistake when he was creating me. There was nothing wrong with my body. And I woke up that morning and I immediately gave my life to Christ.
Wow. What an amazing story. Now, this is where I want to take off and build on this a little bit. One of the things we discovered during the Freedom Quest workshop is that the plans and purposes of Satan are always advanced by deception. When he appeared in the Garden of Eden, he started with deception. Indeed, as God said, he challenged God's word. Now, you alluded to Psalm 139. And in that psalm, David said, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. From before the foundation of the world, God's the one who knit my parts together, literally in my mother's womb. One of the deceptions that start in this battle of gender identity crisis, and that's what I'm going to call it, a confusion, one of the reasons that there's spiritual warfare behind it is the first deception is that God made a mistake. God made a mistake when he created me. Now, you mentioned you were really young when you had your first exposure. Was that one of the thoughts you had, is somehow, I'm a mistake, I'm not the design God has for me?
Yeah, my parents were heavily Christian, and they still are. And I was more like, when you're in middle school, you want to be cool because you want to be like sitting in with your friend group. And that was just what was going on in my friend group. I wanted to be cool too. So I rebelled against my parents because I thought something was wrong with me because that's what people were telling me.
And there's not only the deception that God made a mistake with me, The second part is I can fix that mistake. And when it comes to gender identity confusion, the fix is that I've got the ability, I've got the power to change me into what I could be or should be. What happened to you as you started going through that and started moving down that road toward that idea, I've got to transition?
It didn't do anything to help me. If anything, it made my situation worse. I became depressed. There were multiple situations where I was dealing with suicidal ideation. I was making plans, and I just felt like there was like nothing good for me because I couldn't look at myself in the mirror and see somebody that I was proud of. And so I throughout from 10 years old all the way up until about 15, I was suicidal. I didn't want to be alive.
Wow. I mentioned that I was in the Iowa legislature starting in 2014. I served until 2022, so I served for 8 years. Now, this is kind of unique because I was the only ordained pastor in the Iowa legislature. I'm ordained in the Evangelical Free Church background, but I also travel and minister in the area of spiritual warfare. So just imagine for a moment a politician that believes in God, takes the Bible literally, ordained as a pastor, but also understands a little bit about spiritual warfare. Now, I mentioned that during that time, you were going through your identity crisis. I was serving in the legislature. In 2014, and I'm backing up, it's not that many years ago, we're talking about 10 years ago, this wasn't even on the radar screen in Iowa. The whole concept of wokeness, the whole concept of gender identity crisis, we weren't even hearing about that, except that we started having parents call us as legislators. Not only parents, but grandparents, and inevitably they're sharing a similar story. Our son, our daughter, are beginning to go through things where their personality is changing, they're drifting in their identity, they're changing their name, and many that came back to the school. And we started discovering that the school curriculum, and I'm talking about the public school, started introducing the concepts of gender identity confusion way back in elementary school. Where did you first get exposed to those concepts?
I was first exposed to the concepts in our first ever sexual education class. You know how in like 5th or 6th grade, they introduced you to that concept. They talked about like homosexual relationships and like STDs, that kind of stuff, except they really pushed this sort of narrative that stuff was okay. They wanted you to know this stuff is okay. You can go and do this stuff. And there's some people who may have these body parts that aren't actually, don't identify like that.
Well, one of the other things that started happening is we started tracking down that in these cases we're being called about, there were school teachers in our public schools that were actively involved with the students, and I'm going to say recruiting, and then giving the information, and I could go so far as to almost say brainwashing. And it was done secretively. Now, you touched on the part that your parents did not know that this was happening. Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about that, how it was done in secret, but very actively in the school, you were being fed and, can I use the word coached?
Yeah.
Okay, that'd be a good word. So go ahead and just share on that.
So when I was first exposed to it, I had an art teacher who supported it like wholeheartedly, and he actually left the country because of a few allegations with other students, but he would consistently mention that I looked better as a boy, I should break school rules, wear short wigs, all this other stuff. I should dress the way that, my parents didn't want me to dress. And my mom can even attest that we had a situation where he would refer to me by the name that I wanted to be called when I thought I was a boy. When she asked him not to, straight to his face. And that was kind of when my parents started finding out what was going on, because they weren't told. And here, like, the school didn't reach out and ask, hey, can we call your child this? They waited until, my parents found out and then asked about it.
So then in school, you were already given a male name. Mm-hmm. In the classrooms, that's what you were being called by, is your male name. Mm-hmm. But your parents knew nothing about it. Absolutely nothing. Mm-hmm. Didn't that seem odd to you?
Yeah, it was odd.
And yet you started down that path. You mentioned that you were at the point of either taking hormone therapy or being offered that by the school. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit?
So the therapist who I went to was actually outside of the school, but she wanted to get me hormone therapy because she claimed that my parents were neglecting me by not agreeing to who I truly was or who I truly felt that I was, and so that she would help me go through that process and not tell my parents if I didn't want her to.
So this was official counseling that you were connected to through the teacher, but to someone outside of the school that started working you down that path, hoping you'd move into the hormone therapy.
This was a therapist who was outside of like school, so not related to the school at all, but still another adult that.
So how do you make that contact with the therapist?
So I actually have been in therapy most of my life for other mental issues that I've had, like ADHD, that kind of stuff. And so we'd known her since I was really little. And so my parents thought it was just safe to, take me back and keep me with her. Clearly it was not a good choice though.
Now, one of the things that we hear about a lot on this area is that in the process of working with a student, and you're not alone in this, we've heard about many students that have had similar stories happen to them. But intentionally, if the parents are Christians, they're almost painted as being bad or against you or harming you in some way if they hold to a biblical value system. Did you go through any of that talk against your parents?
Yes, I actually had people who would tell me that your mom looks lesbian. Is your mom lesbian? And I told them that my family is Christian. And then their like idea of my parents would immediately change. They'd be like, oh, your parents are horrible for not allowing you to do all these things. And I'm like, well, I guess I kind of have to agree with that now because I'm having these ideas put in my head. I had teachers say, oh, that's emotional neglect, that they're not allowing you to do these things for yourself, or, and I don't know, I just kind of felt pressured into believing it because they were speaking all these lies about my family.
But what about other students? Were other students involved at all in this process with you?
Yes, I actually had a friend group that were very into the gender identity and sexual ideology, all that kind of stuff. I actually, my first kiss, unfortunately, was another woman who I was like friends with, in a relationship with. And it was because of peer pressure by that friend group who were like, well, you've never kissed a woman, you'll never know how it feels, that kind of stuff. And so they pushed me into a lot of this stuff and tried to, hey, do you want a binder? And what a binder is, if you don't know, is before you get or are pushed into medical transition, they'll give you something that basically constricts your chest. And it's not recommended that you wear it more than 8 hours because it can like damage you. And they recommend that to children who are like 10 to 12 years old who feel that they want to transition socially without medical transition first. And so they kept talking about that, and I like begged my mom to get those things. And so they just introduced all these new ways to jump further and deeper into this idea that I wasn't who I was born as.
This story is powerful to me. And I thank you for being able to share it today, because your story is not unique in today's culture. We're hearing about this more and more and more all the time. One of the things that happens many times with the gender transition is when counselors get involved, if parents start pushing back against it, they'll accuse the parents of some kind of abuse. And there are cases where the child is taken out of the home, especially out of the home of Christians, because they view that this whole thing is abuse. And have you heard of those kinds of things happening?
Yeah.
Maybe you could elaborate a little bit.
I had therapists and school counselors who actually had called social services a few times on my parents. Social services actually dropped the whole situation because they're like, what the heck? She's got, I had everything I needed, and for religious reasons, my parents couldn't agree to do all these social transitioning things, and But I still had teachers who put that idea in my head, and friends that put the idea in my head that, your parents are abusing you because they're not allowing you to do these things, when really my parents were protecting me from falling deeper into something that could potentially medically harm me for life.
We're going to visit that back in a moment and come back to that theme. One of the things we started discovering as legislators in the Iowa legislature were parents calling us and giving us some of the textbooks, some of the books that were available, not only in the library, but used actually in the classrooms for children down into elementary school. And those became the initial deceptions that started someone down this road of moving them along. Did you get referred to you or handed to you any of that kind of material in school?
We actually, in middle school and in my current high school, have an entire section dedicated to LGBTQ stuff. And a lot of the books, if you look into them or look on, there's this place called Goodreads where you can people talk about the books. A lot of them have sex in them, and they are being recommended to children and put in libraries as early as kids who can get to them at about 10.
And we started having material sent to us in the Iowa legislature. Now here's the key. In 2014, this wasn't even on our radar screen. I started having a group like Family Leader come to me as a state representative and said, we need to do something about this. Because one of the issues that was starting to happen in the state of Iowa is they wanted to move to the point where the state had to pay for gender transfer surgeries and procedures for minors in the state of Iowa without the parents knowing about it. Now this becomes really huge. If you don't believe in spiritual warfare, this is something that's incredible in the background. So there were a few of us legislators, we're conservatives, we started picking up on it. And around 2017, I was encouraged to sponsor a bill. And what that bill would do in the state of Iowa, it would prevent anyone from giving hormone therapy or gender transfer surgery to a minor under the age of 18. And I put that bill together, and I was working on it in the legislature while you were going through it. This excites me, and you're not the only person I've met who've gone through this. But let me share this sad story. I brought that bill to our caucus, the Republican caucus. It was shot down so fast, it never got a hearing. And here's the reason why. The vast majority of the Republican legislators said, this is not an issue in Iowa. This is not happening in our schools. Terry, you're just going off on an extreme. Now, I've got to say this. In 2023, that bill was passed in the state of Iowa. They picked up that bill. That's what happened between 2017 and 2022. We started hearing of so many cases like yours that all of a sudden the eyes were open. But the big thing came with the school curriculum that we started finding over and over and over again that was given to us, the LGBTQ curriculum, and there's a big gamut there, and just a lot of stuff that goes with that. And we started going after the idea of curriculum because we recognize if the plans and purposes of Satan are advanced by deception, where does he start planting the seeds of deception? This is spiritual warfare. As young as he possibly can, he puts them in the minds of children. And unfortunately, it's not only in the school curriculum today. You look at what's happening out there in Hollywood. Look at what's happening in the TV media. Look what's happening in that whole gamut out there. I personally believe when it comes to spiritual warfare, there's an intentional effort to take away a biblical Christian value system of our identity. And that identity is something that's not determined by God. It's something that we can determine, that we can change. In other words, we become our own God. We've got power over our own lives. And this is a big thing. Now, had we spent a little bit more time on the fifth level of demonic activity, that's territorial spirits, that deals with what's happening in entire nations, what could be happening in a state. We are going through this in the United States. I'm going to say we're no longer far behind what's happening in Europe. In Europe, this is very common. in a lot of countries over there. Now, I just want to visit something else in your story for a moment, because this is very important. John 10:10 says, the thief, Satan, comes only to steal, to kill, and destroy. But I've come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. That's very important. We started being communicated with in the legislature saying, if we don't give affirmation and support to people who are going through a transition, we are causing them depression and discouragement, and we're the ones that are feeding the suicidal tendencies and thoughts that young people are having. I do not believe that's the truth. I believe the truth is when you change what God created you as in your DNA, and you actually go through a transition, you start fighting against yourself, and there's a battle inside. Now here's the truth with this. The suicide rates among people that have transitioned is extremely high. And there's a point at which you cannot go back. You cannot go back. What happened to you with your thoughts of self-destruction during this process?
The closer I got to the suicidal ideation, and anytime I brought it up, especially with the therapist I was with, she kept, recommending that idea. Oh, well, it's because, you're looking in the mirror. You're not seeing who you want to be or who you believe you are. So let's, recommend you for the hormones and see what happens. And I was actually 2 weeks away from actually being approved for those hormones when I gave my life to Christ, thank goodness. And she even mentioned, in the future, when you're older, you can also do surgeries as well. And it was just like, they want to fix it with changing your physical state and not your mental state. And when what really needs to change is, how you view yourself here, not how you're seeing yourself out here.
Now, when you made, I'm going to say, your decision to remain with your God-given gender because you accepted Christ, you went back to school. And teachers, other students, they knew you were down this road, and you'd pretty much accepted that line of reason that I can change my identity. How were you treated by the teachers and the other students when you decided, no, I'm going to give my life to Jesus and I'm going to retain my identity? What happened then?
I lost 2 friend groups within the span of a year and a half because they didn't want to be associated with somebody who was Christian and had left behind this idea that you can be your own savior. And I had actually a few teachers who, I'd been super close with, they had been my go-to people. They'd been really supportive of me. And they just wouldn't, converse with me after school, or they'd say they were cold, to put it plainly. And it was really hard because I felt like I was kind of by myself. I didn't have any friends. And I started looking for other Christians, other people I could talk with. So thank goodness I have 2 people now. But it's just, every day I go into school, it's like warfare all over the place. I get told to kill myself basically on the daily. But it's, you have to keep pushing through and just show those people God's love, and you can't retaliate in anger, because they see that and then they relate that to God. And if they see that's how you're acting as a Christian, they're going to think that's how God's personality is as well.
We talk a lot, and we got hit with it in the legislature about bullying in the school. And I'm the first to say there are students that are bullied. We were often presented with the notion that it's the conservatives, it's a Christian right that's doing the bullying. I might be reading a little bit into this, and I've been known to do that, okay? And as long as I've got you, I'm going to take advantage of this. It sounds to me like you were the recipient of bullying. When you made the decision to stay with your God-given identity and gender, then you started to be bullied. Is that correct?
Yes. They don't they claim to be tolerant and accepting of people, but the moment that they don't agree with what you what you believe, they're no longer tolerant and accepting of who you choose to be.
You know, one of the things that we encountered, especially when it came to supplemental school aid, which was the money we'd give to our public schools, some of us in the legislature started recognizing that with what was happening in the curriculum, it was wrong to use taxpayer money to support a curriculum that was promoting the LGBTQ notion, and the whole school was moving that direction. So we started pulling back. And the interesting thing that happened is it came to the point where a number of the superintendents and a number of the school districts came to the point of saying, we don't care about the money. We are not giving up our agenda. Now, I want to say this. Satan has an agenda. In spiritual warfare, he has an agenda. And again, John 10:10, the thief comes only to steal, to kill, and destroy. And you can take those three words and look at them in a lot of different applications. For example, someone who's addicted to certain chemicals or drugs, it's unfolding in their life and whatnot. But the same thing happens within this gender drift kind of thing where he's there to steal, to kill, and destroy. When we were working through the legislation, I was handed a book by a secular psychologist who herself came from a background where she was a lesbian and her live-in, but they lost their daughter into the trans community that went through trans surgery and whatnot. And she wrote a book called Irreparable Damage. Irreparable Damage. And it's a book you should just search the title for. It's a non-Christian book, but it's a secular psychologist screaming and saying, something is happening in America today that's very dangerous, that's very dangerous. Now, one of the things that's important, if you go through a total transition of your gender, you come out on the other side. It doesn't matter if you're a male transitioning to a female or a female to a male, you come out sterile. You're no longer able to have children. You're no longer able to give that gift of life to someone else. Were you ever counseled in that direction? Be careful where you're going because it might cause irreparable damage?
I was told that if I did go down that path, there would be a way to reverse it eventually if I chose to do that, which is a lie. They tell you that with the hormones, you can completely reverse it. There are people who have been doing hormones. You'll see their stories online, and they'll still have low voices. They'll have medical issues that they will have to deal with when they detransition.
Terry Baxter is co-founder of Go Serve Global and Freedom Quest Deliverance Training. To book Terry for a Freedom Quest training for your church or ministry, or for more information on Freedom Quest and to order your study resources, connect with Terry at office@goserveglobal.org.